Scott Panetti walked into his in-laws' house and shot his wife's parents in front of her and their child. What followed in his court trial is beyond belief. Imagine a courtroom drama like no other, where the line between sanity and insanity blurs and justice hangs in the balance. In the gripping tale of Scott Panetti, you'll journey through a maze of bewildering events, from a tragic crime to a courtroom spectacle that defied convention. Join us as we look into the Scott Panetti case, where mental illness and the pursuit of justice collide in a story that will both astonish and challenge your understanding of the legal system. Welcome to Grim Riddles. Thank you to our existing subscribers. We appreciate your support. If you haven't already subscribed but enjoyed this video, please like and subscribe. It really does help us. Scott Panetti's day began early on the morning of September the 8th, 1992. He shaved his head, donned camouflage attire, and armed himself. His destination was a house in the Texas Hill Country, where his estranged wife Sonia had taken refuge with her parents, Amanda and Joseph Alvarado. Panetti broke in and cornered his in-laws, Amanda and Joseph Alvarado. In front of his wife and their 3-year-old daughter, Panetti coldly shot the couple, instantly killing them. He then kidnapped his wife and child, taking them to a mountain cabin. He held them hostage, but eventually allowed them to leave. Scott Panetti was born in Hayward, California on the 28th of February 1958. At the age of 18, he left home and joined the Navy, but received an early honorable discharge due, he told his parents, to having arthritis in his hands. He joined his family, who had moved to Texas, where he then got married for the first time. Scott Panetti's bizarre behavior began when he was a teenager.
He was laying on the bed and he had his hands like this. And he's just looking, just staring into space. And I said, "Scott, you acted like you're listening to something." He said, "It's just the music in my head."
From 1981 to 1992, Scott Panetti was hospitalized in over a dozen psychiatric institutions. His medical records from this period are hundreds of pages long.
In 1986, he had a psychotic episode, convinced the devil was in the walls and furniture.
His previous wife divorced him after he buried their furniture because he said it was possessed by the devil, and also nailed his curtains shut.
Also around this time, in 1986, he was having hallucinations, where he saw the devil on the wall of his home and had visions that he killed the devil, then saw blood coming out of the walls. He then thoroughly washed the walls. After his inevitable divorce went through, Scott Panetti became very unstable and moved back to Texas, where in April 1989 he married again, this time to Sonia Alvarado. Scott Panetti was hospitalized with mental health issues on numerous occasions in both Texas and Wisconsin. In 1986 alone, he was hospitalized 9 times, during which his stays lasted anywhere from 4 to 44 days. Panetti was hospitalized on several other occasions in the early 1990s. He was diagnosed with schizophrenia, a chronic disorder characterized by delusions, hallucinations, and impaired cognitive functioning. Panetti also exhibited symptoms of bipolar disorder, which brought extreme mood swings to his already challenging conditions.
I was 18 or 19 when he would call the radio station in Fredericksburg, Texas, and I hadn't seen him in a long time, and he kept calling and saying, "This is Sarge, why won't you play my song? This is Sergeant Ranahan Iron Horse here," and he kept calling over and over until they played his song. And that's when I really realized that he was really getting sick, because that he really thought that he was another person.
As the years went by, Panetti's mental state further deteriorated. He struggled to maintain employment, often felt paranoid and fearful, and displayed erratic behavior. His illness severely impacted his relationships. The lack of proper treatment and support contributed to a downward spiral in his overall well-being. The timeline for all of his hospitalizations up to 1991 proves that long before the crime he was already very ill, which makes his trial even more perplexing. I've put a link to the timeline in the comments section. In 1990, he threatened his wife, baby, and father-in-law as well as himself, so he was involuntarily committed to the Kerrville State Hospital. Records show that Panetti believed there was a plot against him by the citizens of Fredericksburg. Records from this time reveal that he had a series of different personalities or aspects of himself to which he had given names. His illness severely impacted his relationships. He was drinking a lot and becoming violent towards his wife and daughter. Rowena Becker, Sonia's younger sister, once regarded Scott as a caring big brother who babysat her children and shared cooking recipes. However, she noticed warning signs like pill bottles from Kerrville State Hospital in the fridge, and Scott's change in behavior as he started drinking and became violent. The violent episodes escalated, including a terrifying incident where he chased Sonia and their daughter with a rifle. Panetti and Sonia Alvarado separated in August 1992 because of his behavior. Sonia took their 3-year-old daughter and went to stay with her parents, Amanda and Joe Alvarado. She then obtained a restraining order against her husband. The lack of proper treatment and support contributed to a downward spiral in his overall well-being. Tragically, Sonia's parents became his first and final victims. According to reports, Panetti believed that he was carrying out an order from God to protect his family from evil spirits. At his trial, Scott Panetti testified that on the day of the crime he had been under the control of Sarge, later identified as an auditory hallucination. Panetti also said that demons were cackling at him at the time of his crime, so perhaps this harrowing burst of violence was just waiting to happen. It marked the darkest point in Panetti's extensive history of mental illness. In July 1994, a competency hearing was held to determine if he had the mental capacity to understand the court proceedings and assist in his defense.
My name is Preston Douglas. I was Scott's primary appointed attorney in 1992. My interviews with Scott were lengthy and numerous over 2 or 3 years, in things like being spoken to from voices and visited in dreams and other beings being involved with Scott, from some celestial or old cowboys talking to him in his sleep. Those sort of things were fairly common. When you would show up for court, you never knew which Scott Panetti was going to show up to court with you. I was first appointed to represent Scott in September of 1992 and ultimately was discharged by Scott in June of 1995.
His lawyer testified that in the previous 2 years he had no useful communication with Panetti because of his delusional thinking. A psychiatrist for the defense concluded that Panetti was not competent to stand trial. Panetti was found to be suffering from a fragmented personality, delusions and hallucinations, for which he had been hospitalized over 12 times and for which he had been prescribed high doses of powerful psychiatric drugs for schizophrenia. Panetti's first wife testified at the competency hearing and described one of Panetti's psychotic episodes in 1986. During that episode, Panetti had become convinced the devil had possessed their home, and in an effort to cleanse their surroundings, Panetti had buried a number of valuables next to the house and engaged in other rituals. Even with this testimony, Panetti was found competent to be tried and competent to waive his rights to counsel. While in the Bell County Jail waiting for his capital trial to begin, Panetti suffered from a paranoid delusion that his attorneys were conspiring against him with the sheriff and other law enforcement officers. Calling himself a born-again April Fool, he quit taking his prescribed medications, stating that he didn't need them because he was a Gnostic Nazarene who had been spiritually healed. The trial went on, with the prosecution presenting evidence, including eyewitness testimonies and forensic evidence. Panetti decided to waive his right to counsel.
Since before his trial, Scott Panetti has refused all medicine to treat his schizophrenia. Scott contends that on April 1st, 1995, angels visited him in his prison cell and cured him of his mental illness. In the past 10 years, Scott's condition has deteriorated significantly.
I'm Mark Cunningham. I'm a clinical and forensic psychologist in private practice. I was asked to evaluate Mr. Scott Panetti. First, he exhibited disorganized thought processes and speech, which is pretty typical of somebody who is actively schizophrenic or actively psychotic. He exhibited flight of ideas, which means that his train of thought jumped from one subject to another without any clear connection between them. He exhibited tangentiality, which means that he would begin talking about one thing and then go off into lots of other things. Those are the sorts of disorganization of thought symptoms that are often observed in somebody who is actively schizophrenic.
Despite the objections of his lawyers, his family, and even the prosecution, the judge allowed Panetti to represent himself, and the case went to trial in September 1995. Observers variously described the trial as a farce, a joke, a circus, and a mockery. In post-conviction affidavits, numerous witnesses, including doctors, lawyers, and relatives who appeared at the trial, said that they concluded from their prior knowledge of Panetti and their observations of him during the proceedings that he was incompetent to stand trial.
Panetti's murder trial drew headlines when he was allowed to represent himself after dismissing his court-appointed attorney. He dressed as a cowboy in a purple suit and a hat, and the witnesses he tried to subpoena in his defense included John F. Kennedy, the Pope, and Jesus Christ. At one point, he assumed his alternate personality of Sarge and testified in the third person about how he carried out the murders.
He was more obsessed with how he looked and his fantasy of being his own lawyer in a 1930s cowboy costume than what reality was, and that was that he was under trial for murder. He didn't understand that.
A doctor who had treated Panetti for schizophrenia in 1986 concluded that he was acting out the role of an attorney as a facet of the mental illness, not a rational decision to represent himself.
I said, show the medical records. And then he'd finally get it up to the judge. The judge would say, I can't accept that. You scribbled on it. Throw it out.
From a clinician's point of view, I would say he was paranoid, he was delusional, basically a grossly psychotic, paranoid individual who seemed to have a pure psychiatric disorder. It's rare that I've seen someone that sick. It's very clear to me that he has a chronic paranoid schizophrenia, and it's severe.
Some observers in their post-trial affidavits were scathing about the fact that Panetti was allowed to stand trial. These are some of their comments. My main impression was, why was the judge allowing this crazy man to defend himself? I thought to myself, my God, how in the world can our legal system allow an insane man to defend himself? How can this be just? I not only thought that Scott was incompetent, but that it was not moral to have him stand trial. It was terribly wrong. I did not know that our legal system would allow an insane man to represent himself in his own trial. Another said, there is no question in my mind that Scott was incompetent at his trial. Scott's questions and conduct were bizarre and represented a break from reality. Scott's conduct was bizarre in part due to his unusual dress, which I can only call a costume. Scott was more concerned with his dress and appearance than the reality of his capital murder trial. The courtroom had the atmosphere of a circus. Still another said, at the trial, Scott dressed in a 1920s era cowboy style. It looked idiotic. He wore a large hat and a huge bandana. He wore weird boots with stirrups. The pants were tucked in at the calf. Despite this clear display of his mental illness, the jury rejected Panetti's plea of not guilty by reason of insanity and found him guilty of capital murder. Panetti was still allowed to represent himself during the sentencing phase of the trial with rambling and incoherent statements. It is difficult to understand how this was allowed in a court of law regarding a death penalty case. I really can't get my head around this one. The jury sentenced him to death on September the 22nd, 1995. According to several observers and his standby attorneys, Panetti's behavior had scared and antagonized the jurors who feared that he might be released from prison someday. The verdict sparked controversy, as many believed his mental illness should have been taken into greater consideration.
I thought the first day that the judge was going to stop it. No judge in his right mind will hold a trial like this. And it went on. It went on. I've lost a lot of faith in the justice system, and I've lost a lot of faith even in my country. I can't believe that they let this happen, in the United States.
The Scott Panetti case saw a series of appeals and legal battles over the years. His lawyers consistently argued that his mental illness made him unfit for execution. Panetti's appeals were unsuccessful in the Texas courts, and the U.S. Supreme Court initially declined to review his case. In a 1996 affidavit, Sonia Alvarado recalled a number of incidents prior to the crime in which she alleged that the police had failed to act on the family's concerns about the threat that Scott Panetti posed. She recalled one incident only weeks before the killing of her parents. My mother and I begged the police to take the rifles. Scott had his deer rifle, the .306 rifle he later used to kill my parents, and another shotgun at my parents' house. Even though the police were told to take the guns, they did not. She says that on the day of the crime, injured and traumatized and not provided medical attention or counseling, she made a statement to the police. She recalls, about a week later, when my head and memory became more clear, I told the DA I wanted to add more events as they came to my memory. He told me it was best to leave things as they were, and they would stick to the original statement given. I told him there were more things I wanted to add in, but the DA told me it wasn't important. He wanted to stay with the first statement. I feel this was wrong of him. I feel now that I was used on the stand so that I would cover up for the law enforcement mistakes and the sheriff knowing Scott's mental illness for years, not to mention all the other reports that were not written out. Sonia Alvarado later wrote, I do not hate Scott. I hate what Scott did. Scott was a good person, except when he changed. I know now that Scott is mentally ill and should not be put to death. In 2008, Panetti was again found fit for execution, and in 2013, the affirmation set the execution date for December 3, 2014. Hours before he was to be executed, the Fifth Circuit Court issued a stay, acknowledging Panetti's deteriorating mental state. In October 2022, a third competency hearing led Judge Pittman to rule against Panetti's execution, citing concerns about retribution and humanity. Attorney Gregory Weircock stated that it prevents Texas from exacting vengeance on someone with severe schizophrenia. During all these appeals, the state of Texas still tried to argue for the execution to go ahead. They conceded that Scott Panetti was severely mentally ill, having been repeatedly diagnosed with schizophrenia and paranoid delusions over a period of 4 decades, before and after he murdered his in-laws in 1992. Prosecutors accepted that Panetti thinks a device was implanted in his tooth during a prison dental procedure to either spy on him or broadcast thoughts into his brain. They also agreed that he falsely believed U.S. Supreme Court Justice Amy Coney Barrett visited him on death row. And they acknowledged that he is sure he killed Joe and Amanda Alvarado 30 years ago, only after an evil spirit named Sarge Ironhorse took over his body. Despite all that, they still fought to have him executed. In one of his appeals, Scott sometimes pointed out Bible passages to his attorneys or rapidly patted his graying sandy hair flat onto his forehead, jingling the chain connecting his wrist to his ankle. His disheveled hair and shaggy white beard clashed with the button-down shirts and slacks his attorneys brought him to wear. Except for a brief period shortly after his arrival on death row, Panetti has not taken any medication since April 1, 1995, and his mental condition has continued to deteriorate. Many mental health professionals have testified to the fact that without medication, Panetti is severely psychotic and paranoid, and they have diagnosed him with a fixed delusion, a thought disorder so severe and pervasive that his capacity for cognitive functioning has been impaired significantly. The centerpiece of Panetti's delusion is his belief that the state is part of a satanic conspiracy to prevent him from preaching the gospel in prison.
We have 3 efforts going on simultaneously. We're in the Fifth Circuit, where we are seeking time and resources to litigate Scott's competence to be executed because his psychiatric condition continues to deteriorate day by day. We're also in the U.S. Supreme Court, where we are arguing that it is unconstitutional to execute the seriously mentally ill. And finally, we have a 30-day reprieve request before the governor, Rick Perry, saying that we would like additional time to, again, litigate Scott's competence to be executed.
Can we back up and go to the trial? Can you describe the scene in the courtroom and explain how was it that he was allowed to represent himself?
This is a question that no one can answer sufficiently. Scott was wearing a cowboy outfit during this trial. His jeans were tucked into his boots. He had on a TV Western cowboy shirt, a purple bandana around his neck, and he was waving a cowboy Bible. He was representing himself because before the trial began, he became extremely paranoid. He was off his medication, and he believed that his lawyers were in league against him. So he fired them, and he told the judge that he wanted to represent himself. Oddly, though, the judge allowed this after having sat through 2 competency trials and knowing Scott's 12-year history at the time of chronic paranoid schizophrenia. To this day, there has not been an adequate explanation by the Texas justice system as to how this man was permitted to fight for his life on his own in a death penalty trial.
The U.S. Supreme Court heard arguments in Panetti's case in the spring of 2007, in the case of Panetti versus Quarterman. On June 28, 2007, in a 5-4 decision, the justices ruled in his favor and blocked his execution. In 2008, Mr. Panetti was again assessed for competency and found fit to be executed. This decision was affirmed in 2013, and Mr. Panetti's execution was set for December 3, 2014. Just hours before the scheduled execution, the Fifth Circuit Court issued a stay and later ruled that Mr. Panetti's attorneys presented sufficient evidence to prove his deteriorating mental stability since the second competency hearing, entitling him to expert assistance and counsel as well as a new hearing. The court questioned the value of executing someone who does not comprehend why he is being put to death and found that the Fifth Circuit had used an improperly restrictive test in deciding that Panetti was competent to be executed.
And the Supreme Court, while not going quite that far with mental illness, has said very clearly that if someone is so delusional that they don't have a firm grasp on reality at the time they commit their crime, that person should not be executed. That should be recognized as a mitigating factor. And yet Texas has ignored the evidence, continuous evidence for over 30 years that Scott Panetti is highly delusional due to his schizophrenia. And this is not a recent phenomenon with Scott Panetti. He was hospitalized 10 times prior to his crime. In the course of 12 years, he was hospitalized 10 times. He has been consistently delusional, and irrational, really, since the crime. This has not changed. Every evaluation that's been done of him establishes that. It's not been, frankly, controverted by the prosecution, and yet, despite the Supreme Court's decision, Texas is proceeding with executing him, and that would be just a gross injustice. No matter how you feel about the death penalty, people in this country recognize that it should be used only for the worst of the worst, with no mitigating factors, and here this case has all sorts of mitigating factors.
In October 2022, a third competency hearing for Mr. Panetti was held. After hearings, arguments, and evidence, Judge Pittman held that Ms. Panetti could not be executed. He said, "There are several reasons for prohibiting the execution of the insane, including the questionable retributive value of executing an individual so wrecked by mental illness that he cannot comprehend the meaning and purpose of the punishment, as well as society's intuition that such an execution simply offends humanity." Scott Panetti is one of those individuals. Scott Panetti's attorney, Gregory Weirkoch, issued a statement saying that Judge Pittman's decision prevents the state of Texas from exacting vengeance on a person who suffers from a pervasive, severe form of schizophrenia that causes him to inaccurately perceive the world around him. This ruling was made on September 28, 2023. The judge determined that Panetti's well-documented mental illness and disorganized thoughts prevented him from understanding the reason for his execution. As a result, his current execution date has not been scheduled.
District Judge Robert Pittman ruled Wednesday that Panetti is not sane enough to be executed for the murder of his in-laws in 1992. The court deemed that Panetti lacked a rational understanding of the connection between his actions and his death sentence.
This is an article written by Dallas Ducar on the 31st of December 2014. We've only used a few paragraphs, which we have summarized for this conclusion, as a lot of the article is on the history of this case, which we have already covered. The United States, rooted in retributive justice, faces a dilemma on the effectiveness of capital punishment. The question arises, does killing the convicted truly alleviate the pain, or could restorative justice offer more by promoting dialogue and reparations for affected families and communities? In the case of Scott Panetti, influenced by a mind grappling with reality, full blame becomes questionable. Should the government execute a citizen for action stemming from a dysfunctional organ, especially when mental states tied to physiological dysfunction are not treated like other medical conditions? Advocating for rehabilitation and human flourishing, the focus should shift from a choice between death and insanity to genuine incentives for healing. The impact of murder extends beyond victims and families, affecting entire communities and nations, challenging the notion of closure. The call for change emphasizes a need to prioritize healing over execution, fostering a justice system centered on rehabilitation and well-being. And that, Grim Riddlers, is the sad and very controversial case of Scott Panetti. But did it need to be? Scott was obviously severely mentally ill. His strange behavior and delusions were documented for many years before the murders. How the judge allowed him to defend himself is a mystery, and many people are still baffled by the decision. We are too. What are your opinions on this case? Do you agree with the prosecution or the defense? We do believe that a lot more discussion needs to be held regarding the issue of mental illness, crime, and the justice system. Thank you for watching to the end, and until next time, be safe.